I was planning to end my talk with the breathing exercise, but I think I will start with it, okay? Just to feel relaxed and centered and overcome my first fear. I'm so happy to see so many of you. So many of you stayed. You might expect something from me, something to inspire you, challenge your preconceptions. What are your expectations? I mean, what gives me the legitimacy to talk to you today? Okay, I'm a filmmaker, I'm supposed to know a bit of literature, a bit of politics, psychiatry, imaging, architecture, walls in architecture. Okay. As an Arab woman filmmaker, what do you expect from me? Talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict, the walls between the East and the West, anti-Semitism, maybe Islamophobia? No? Okay. As a filmmaker, shades and shadows in cinema, or maybe bringing Arab cinema out of the shadows? As a woman, maybe gender issues in walls, in problems between men and women and gender issues, or maybe the popular saying that our mothers used to tell us, the shadow of a man is better than the shadow of a wall. ظل راجل أحسن من ظل حيطة. Well, I'm going to disappoint you a little. I'm not going to tackle these subjects. These you could know at home, on the internet, in the news. I'm going to talk about my personal journey in deconstructing my walls using the creative process. The power of the creative process in defeating my own fears. This is what I'm going to talk to you about. Okay, who I am? Who am I? I was born in Cairo, in a Christian family. I grew up in a safe bourgeois environment where to the age of 20, all the decisions were taken for me. I was not destined at all to work in cinema, even though I come from a family who's been in the cinema business from the beginning of the 1950s. My father, a self-made man with Levantine roots, made his way in the cinema industry as one of the most prominent distributors in the golden years of Egyptian cinema. My maternal uncle became one of the most famous, if not the most famous filmmaker in the Arab world, Youssef Chahine. My father invested a lot in me and sent me to the best universities where I studied, like many of you, economics and political science. My father did everything to take me away from this field. And he used to tell me, your uncle is a genius, but he's crazy, and I don't want you to work with him. And that was another fear, the fear of disappointing my father. Or maybe I waited until my father's death until I started working in this field. And maybe this was the fear of killing the father in me. I was introduced to the field by my maternal uncle, but I was not allowed to touch the creative process. Of course, I started as an executive producer. I was responsible of 120 people, and I used to deal with figures because I was very familiar with that. But I was afraid. I was afraid of the so many talents around me because I had not studied the grammar of cinema, and the camera was a monster to me. I was so afraid, and it was so intimidating to have so many technicians and the heavy machinery around me, and so many people working. Having specialized in economic development, I had a sense for the other. I wanted to do documentary films. And I was frightened by this creative process, and I had so much lack of confidence. But I was always interested in those topics: identity, roots, social justice, sense of belonging, alienation. I had to deconstruct this fear to start making documentary films, which means using film as a medium of expression. I waited until the digital cameras came, and this was such a liberating element for me, where I could use the camera by myself. And only when I started making the films, I started to consciously deconstruct my own walls. My first film was a story about this Italian woman who spoke French at home, and she was a ballerina and a ballet teacher, and she taught 3 generations of Cairene, daughters of Cairene bourgeois society. She left her mark on many generations, not only on their ballet apprenticeship, but above all on the more mundane things in life. I hadn't realized that I was doing a film about her identity, but also about mine. It was her feeling of alienation and my feeling of alienation. My family is a family of migrants who flew away from the Ottoman in Syria and Lebanon in the 19th century to settle in Egypt. So I had a great Greek grandfather, and I had a Greek grandmother, and I always had issues of belonging. I'm an Arab, I'm an African, I'm an Egyptian, Mediterranean, a Levantine, or simply a woman with mixed roots. I became obsessed with archives and footage, and I plunged into the history of Egyptian cinema, only to discover that women had started cinema in Egypt. I was so empowered by these women, and I even called the film Women Who Loved Cinema. And these women who were telling their stories with film, I mean, they were not educated, but they wanted to act. So they did everything to have these films made, and they surrounded themselves with a lot of men, educated men, good writers, and they made the film. They had this entrepreneurial drives, and some of them did, two of them did 50 films each. These women made it in a very patriarchal society. Their desire, stubbornness, and perseverance made them succeed. I was proud and inspired by these women who felt empowered enough to tell their stories and transcend women who had endured years of abuse in a world of men. I learned a lot of things about self-confidence and treasures, and then I wanted to go further in the human nature, and I decided to plunge deeper in the human nature, and I spent 8 months in 2 of the most enclosed Cairo mental hospitals. I spent 8 months there getting to know all the people who theoretically were living in the shadows, but I realized that these people were unveiling all the society's ills. So a voice was given to these men and women cast in the shadows, carrying within them the society's ill. I felt very much in my comfort zone in the hospital. So I was wondering what was going on. And I learned a lot about injustice and humiliation. And then I realized that all my life I've been working on defeating the walls of others. Why do I always hide behind others? Why don't I confront my own walls? I would be lying to you if I tell you that I woke up one morning and found myself free. No, luckily, or not luckily, I had a major illness where I had cancer, and one morning I found myself with this big health issue, which was breast cancer. And from my experience and talking to other women, I understood that many women develop breast cancer, especially when they suffer from suppression, oppression, or any form of stress. That accident changed my whole perception of life. So I decided to explore my inner self, break my own walls, be aware of myself, of my differences, of my own fears. And I traveled inward. In my new film, I tried to understand my childhood problems. I tried to understand more basic walls about abandonment and rejection. I learned that through the family footage and through a lot of witnesses that my mother, having 2 children, did not want to have another child, and especially not a girl. Anyway, it took me a long way to understand what was going on. And I decided to call the film My Mother Was Imperfect, But I Still Love Her. And without realizing, I was killing the mother in me. It took me 40 years after I graduated to break the color of my own wall, to remove the masks and reverse my perception of what is good and turn these adversities into opportunities. I'm not asking you to wait so long or kill your father or your mother, okay? But you could use the creative process to break your own walls. When there is a wall, there is a will, and there is always a breakthrough. It took me a lifetime, and this is the reason why I'm here today, to help you start breaking your own walls. Walling is a human impulse, yet the creative spirit is a much stronger impulse. And there are several ways to free yourself from your own walls, and of course the creative process is definitely a very powerful one. You could learn the techniques, but the creative process has no boundaries. Whatever you do, whatever your background, your studies, you can still do it. Start looking into your inner self. Be aware of yourself. Feel grounded. And by aligning with your true inner self, inspired action will become easier, and you can begin to find the existing freedom. There's a say that I like that says, be like water making its way to the cracks. Be flexible enough and go with the flow. But whatever you do, do it with authenticity and do it with love, and especially do it with pleasure if you can. Thank you.